there is a very powerful claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is presenting to us. And the claim is that when you look at all of the ideologies and philosophies that exist in the world, what is presented by the Quran, for the sake of humanity, there is nothing equal to it. Now when you look at the history of Shia Islam, from the time of the Imams of the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam, and on to the years even after the time of the 12th Imam when he goes into Ghaiba, you'll notice something very interesting. And this is something that has been recorded by historians. They explain that when you look at the history of Shia Islam, it is full of bloodshed. It is full of oppression. Ash-Shahristani, for example, who's written a phenomenal book, Al-Milal wal-Nihal, and this book, what he does is he breaks down all of the different sects that arise or arose during the time of the caliphates, during the time of the Abbasids, during the time of the Bani Umayyah, and so on and so forth. So he goes into the history as to how these sects came about and the effects they had within the Muslim population as a whole. He says when it comes to the Imami sect, the Imami denomination, he says, I have never read or have never experienced the amount of bloodshed that was shed during the time of the Bani Umayyah, likewise the Bani Abbas, simply because people held the opinions of the concept of imama. So when he turns to the Shias in specific, he says that they have been the most oppressed. This is significant, especially in this day and age, because this history is something that we have heard of many at times. In every majalis that we sit throughout Muharram, we hear about the oppressions of the Shia and the oppressions of the Ahlul-bayt. It's as if a sunnah, a practice has developed that to identify as a Shia Muslim, it is very, very difficult to do so. Now when you come back to the claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is presenting here, He's saying that a time will come when a man will return. And of course this is part of our Aqidah. The Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. When he returns and he takes power or he takes government, the authority of the government when it comes into his hands, he will then practically implement the values of the Holy Quran. And when the values of the Holy Quran are practically implemented on a global level, on a political level, you will see the effects directly within society. Inna hadha al-Quran yahdi lillati hiya aqwam. The claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making is it's a remarkable claim. Allah is saying that you can rule for as long as you want. You can implement all of the different ideologies and philosophies you wish, but they will all categorically fail, one after another. Mankind, I am giving you the opportunity. I am giving you the flexibility and the opportunity to rule, to create a perfect system, but just know that there will be no system that is as perfect as a system that is embodied and implemented using the values of the Holy Quran. When the Imam comes, Allah will then say to the mankind that this is an individual, through his infallibility, alongside the message of the Holy Quran, he will then propose a system that is absolutely perfect. Any system other than the Holy Quran is doomed to fail, and that is inevitable. That's the claim Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making. Now as Shias, when you look at our history, we have been marginalized, we have been stigmatized. Now we're living in a time where we are stigmatized not because we are Shias, but specifically because we are Muslims. So that level of oppression has expanded. The borders of it has expanded. People are stigmatized, people are oppressed, people are oppressed simply because they identify themselves as Muslims. So now, in 2023, you realize that being a Shia and to preserve the Shia identity has become even more difficult. From a broader spectrum, there is oppression from outside towards myself because I identify as a Muslim, but within the circles of Muslims as well, I see and I face oppression because I am a Shia. There are certain countries, if you dare to call yourself a Shia, you are stigmatized, you are abused, and you will see some levels of oppression being directed towards you within the Muslim community. So there is a threat from both fronts, an internal threat and an external threat. So again, being a Shia and to uphold the Shia identity in this day and age is even more difficult. Now in tonight's discussion, I wish to talk about the idea of Islamophobia. Islamophobia, very interestingly, has arisen more so in the past 20-23 years, where Muslims are now being oppressed for a number of different reasons. But what is important for us is to understand, where did this ideology stem from? What are the roots of the ideologies of Islamophobia? And what are our responsibilities towards it? It's easy to speak about what our responsibilities are towards it, but we need to understand where exactly is it stemming from. Why is it that there are people who believe in the ideas that they have? Why do they have such ideas where they are very easily tempted to behave with other human beings in the way they behave? Researchers in akhlaq, researchers in this area of Islamophobia have come forward and have proposed a number of different ideas. One of them is a very interesting concept, and they speak about the concept of otherization, the idea of otherizing other individuals. So what happens is, there is a group within a community, you see them very, very differently. So you otherize them, you exclude them, you create an out group. They're not part of your group, you're not including them as part of your group, you separate them. By separating them, you're alienating them. You see, there's a very powerful philosophy that we all live our lives by. This particular philosophy governs our lives. It's something that is shared between secular values and Islamic values, interestingly enough. And that philosophy is known as the Golden Principle. The term that is given is the Golden Principle. We all know what it is. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. You've heard this many a times before, yes? Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. All of the Imams have spoken about the golden rule. Akhlaqan, when you approach people in society, treat them the way you would want to be treated. It's a fundamental principle. It's a rudimentary aspect of how we should behave with one another. But what's interesting is that there is a context as to how this particular philosophy is to be understood. Because it doesn't work. If I was to treat you the way I want to be treated, it wouldn't nurture a strong relationship between ourselves. It could go the other direction. It could break a relationship. Within a marriage, for example, if the husband and the wife were to both treat each other the way they want to be treated, that marriage will not last. The husband, let's say he comes home, he's had a long day, he wants to sit down and just chill. The wife, when she sees that the husband has come home, she will come sit next to the husband. And then she would start talking. How was your day? What did you eat? The husband has just had a tiring day. He needs to relax, he needs peace, he needs quiet. So here, if the husband, for example, was to treat his wife the way he wants to be treated, he would not engage in a discussion at all. Because he wants peace and he expects quiet from his wife. The wife, likewise, if she was to behave with her husband the way she likes to be treated, which is to engage in a discussion and to keep up with that discussion, then naturally what would happen? You develop expectations with one another. When those expectations are not met, then there is frustration. And when there is frustration, there are barriers in that marriage, in that specific marriage. So there has to be compromises. But generally speaking, the golden principle is strong. Behave with others the way you would want to be behaved. The concept of otherization is when you do not behave with others the way you would want to be behaved. In fact, you create a reality, a false pretense within your mind. You concoct a reality where the other person is deserving less than what I have. So that's a standard that you've created. It's a psychological concept where the human being believes, he authentically believes that there is a group, they do not deserve what I have. I deserve more than what they have. In fact, these are one of the earlier stages towards genocide. When you look at, for example, sociologists, they say that Othering is one of the beginning stages which eventually, if it's not nurtured and not tackled properly, it could end up as, or it could lead towards genocide. So when you look at the whole concept of Islamophobia, Islamophobia is when Muslims are alienated from the rest of society. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The concept of othering can manifest itself in a number of different ways. And we see the social implications of this within society. The first, racism. That's a manifestation of othering. You have one race that believes that he is superior than the other race. So he has, for example, certain rights, and he believes that those rights cannot be given to that specific group. So there is that process of othering taking place. Socioeconomical factors. The way we interact with the rich is very different to how we interact with the poor. It's very, very different. The way we speak, the way we give our time to them is very, very different. Perhaps it's done consciously, majority of the time it's done subconsciously. Very interestingly, when you look at the history of the A'immat al-Athar, Imam al-Hassan, they say one day he was walking, alayhi salam, he was walking, he saw a group of beggars, they invited him to come sit with them. The Imam dismounts from his ride and he sits with them. He spends some time with them. So when you look at the nurturing, the qualities and the characteristics of the A'imma, they teach us that there is no distinguishment between the rich and the poor. Treat everyone in the same way. Do not otherize, do not exclude them, do not alienate them from society. Make them inclusive, make them feel as if they are a part of society. Socioeconomical factors, we see a great deal of it today. You know, there are certain billion-dollar corporations today. Yeah, you have Starbucks and you have McDonald's and so on and so forth. The amount of profits they generate is unbelievable. Yet they're having a very difficult time to pass a law where they raise minimum wage. Well, why is that? Many of us, we say, well, if they're worth so much, it's easy to just raise the standard of wage amongst their workers. It creates loyalty, it helps them, it creates ease in their standard of living in their lives and so on and so forth. If I was in their position, in a heartbeat, I would make sure that my employees are looked after. But when you bring in the concept of otherization, it gives a different perspective. It changes the whole paradigm of the discussion. To them, they believe that those who are beneath them do not deserve it. That's the whole concept of otherization. They have certain standards, they have certain rights, and they believe that these standards cannot be given to those who are underneath them. That's why there are blockages of rules and laws that prevent them from raising minimum wage and so on and so forth. So we see a lot of it within contemporary societies. When you look at, for example, homelessness, the way we treat the homeless, it's different. It's not how we treat others. So subconsciously, we've otherized them. Beyond that, and this is very, very dangerous, you'll find that in social media, the homeless are seen as a form of entertainment. You'll have influencers going around taking videos of how they give sadaqah for the sake of views. So now oppression to the homelessness in the name of God, in the name of entertainment, in the name of giving a public image, social media has exacerbated the situation. Does the end justify the means? Because you're giving sadaqah and you're filming their reaction for the sake of views, does that make the whole process good and morally correct? When you look at, for example, those who have disabilities, you see, these are all different manifestations of othering. In fact, the whole concept of othering has always existed within history of mankind. Nabi Nuh alayhi salam, they say when he propagated his message and he brought forth Tawheed, one of the reaction of his community, the opposition of his community, the arguments that they presented was this concept of othering. They came towards Nabi Nuh and they said, we refuse to accept your message. He says, why? He says, because of the people that follow you. He says, the people that follow you, the ayah of the Quran says, the people that follow you are the weak of our society. They're not wealthy the way we are wealthy. They are the riffraff of society. They're feeble-minded. They don't even have good intellect. These are your followers, Ya Nuh. Why should we follow you? So there was that process of othering, and they created an image of Nabi Nuh alayhi salam based on the followers that he was surrounded by. So the concept of othering has always existed. Now what happens is that this process of othering develops. And when it develops, there is a concept of violence that is associated with it. There is a process and an evolution that takes place. When you look at Islamophobia, Islamophobia is the idea that Muslims do not deserve certain rights. They do not deserve certain standards that the rest of society deserve. Now there are three reasons as to why this concept of othering develops is with respects to Muslims. So we need to understand where this concept of othering is coming from towards Muslims and what our responsibility or how we can counteract these three particular areas. The first, and this was seen a lot in the past 20 years or so, the idea that Islam is a violent religion. And this idea has been propagated very, very openly and publicly. Islam is a violent religion. Usually when you turn to the news, you have, for example, ISIS and Daesh all over the front lines, the headlines. 20 years ago, it was the Taliban, and so on and so forth. In the next 10 years, it will be a different group. You see, this idea that a fringe within the Muslim community exists who are violent, this isn't something new, by the way. It's always existed. It existed in the time of Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhim salam. They were known as the Khawarij alayhi salam. They were known as the Khawarij. The Khawarij were the ones who fought against Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. In Nahrawan, they developed a hatred towards Imam Ali alayhi salam. Why? Because the Imam ended the Battle of Siffin through an arbitration. So the Khawarij, very interestingly, they had hatred towards the Banu Umayyah from one perspective, but then they developed hatred towards Amir al-Mu'mineen. So they made enemies from all perspectives. They say during the time of the 4th and 5th Imam, what would they do? They were considered to be the terrorists of their day and age. They would go to a village, they would see if there were Shias, followers of the Imam, they would kill. And they would plunder and loot all of the belongings. It didn't matter whether the victims were women or children. Anyone who came in their way, they would kill. That's the manifestation of terrorism. It existed in the time of the Imams as well. When you look at, for example, Hollywood, for the past 20 years, Muslims are seen in a very specific image, in a vilified image, yes? Muslims are seen as dangerous people, and so on and so forth. Very recently, Bollywood has started the trend as well. You find that there are certain blockbusters that were published by Bollywood that victimized and vilified Muslims. The Kerala story just this year, earlier this year, the Kashmir files. All of these are publications or productions which go about extensively vilifying the image of Muslims. And these were so-called supposed to be based on true stories. And very research is required to show that they are fabrications. The Kashmir files, for example, looks into the history of how Muslims committed a massacre against the Hindus in Kashmir. Well, it never existed. The Kerala story is about how Hindu women were now coming towards the religion of Islam only to serve as brides to those who fought in Afghanistan. Again, false, fabrications. But the image is there. And the first impression always makes the hardest impression. Huh? It's very easy to implant a thought in someone's mind, and it's very, very difficult to remove it. So the damage is done. So when you look at, for example, media and the role that the media plays, it plays a very powerful role in controlling, conditioning the minds of the people. So you found that in response to this, scholars, speakers, during Muharram, outside of Muharram, within universities, they would go around talking about the whole history of Islamophobia and the roots of Islamophobia. They would say, for example, if you believe that Islam is a violent religion and there are evidences to show that the Prophet engaged in tens of battles, well, look at the nature of those battles. Majority of those battles were defensive. We've heard this before. We've had these discussions before. The battles that the Holy Prophet engaged in during his time were all defensive. Very rare cases, the battle was offensive. One example is the battle of Dhat al-Salasil. This is mentioned in Surah Al-Adiyat when Allah says, وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا. and so on and so forth. He is now speaking of a battle that took place during the Prophet's stay in the city of Medina. They say 12,000 men had gathered in a valley known as the Valley of Dhat al-Salasil. 12,000 soldiers, that's not a small amount. They gathered together, tribes from different areas of Hijaz, they got together, they gathered their resources and they made a pledge with one another. Islam has to be destroyed. Jibreel descends, he tells Rasulullah, the threat is imminent, the threat is critical. You don't know of it, but we're telling you, very soon this battle will commence, they will come towards you, you do not know it, they're coming from the valleys, you cannot see them, and they will wipe out the religion of Islam. You need to attack them before they attack you. So even though the battle itself was offensive, from the root of it, it was defensive. Because if the Prophet had not attacked them, then it would have been critical. The message of Islam would have been hindered. So the Prophet sends Abu Bakr, he fails. The Prophet then sends Umar, he fails. Then the Prophet sends Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam. When the Imam goes, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So when... Ya Ali. So when the Imam goes, the narration says, he recites Salatul Fajr. When he recites Salatul Fajr, he then charges towards the enemies. The enemies are sluggish at that time. Yes, Salatul Fajr, the sun hasn't risen yet. This was one of the military cognizance of the Imam alayhi salam. He was very smart in how to delegate his affairs, especially when it came to war and the ethics of war associated with it. As soon as he finished Salat al-Fajr, he charged towards the enemies. In a number of hours, he was able to suppress the threat. The loot, the battle, the war booty that was acquired, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says it was second to what was acquired from the Battle of Khaybar. It was a significant battle that existed within the period of the Holy Prophet of Islam. Ya Ali. So this battle was offensive, but it's a very rare occurrence. It's not something that naturally took place during the Prophet's life. Majority of the battles were defensive. So you had scholars that began to highlight these issues. That no, although the Prophet engaged in all of these battles, they were defensive in nature. I remember one researcher, Sunni, from the Ahlul-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, he said something very interesting. He said, when the whole incident of 9/11 happened, I as an academic, what I did was I went through different universities. I used to sit down with the Muslims, with the non-Muslims. I would go through the whole history of Islamophobia, the ethics and the morality associated with it, the philosophy that they have, the ideologies they have, the effects of their ideologies. I would talk about Islamophobia from an academic perspective. He said, I did this for 10, 15 years. Looking back, you know what my effect was? Nothing. Why? Because this approach was an academic approach. We spoke about this a few nights ago. Rationality sometimes doesn't work because people aren't interested in intellectual discussions. Some benefit from it, but the majority of the people do not appreciate a rational intellectual discussion. So he said, I started hearing stories from America of how people from being hardliners in their thoughts were now becoming Muslims. They were now embracing Islam. What happened? He said people in the communities, in the mosques, in the masajid, sometimes the elders, sometimes certain individuals in the communities, they would invite these people who had Islamophobic traits to their own homes. They would sit down, they would have a banter, they would have a laugh, they would sit down for biryani. In the end, a person would have and develop a very different approach towards this religion of Islam. His perspective of Islam would have changes completely. Why? Because of that physical interactions and the showing of akhlaq. He said 15 years, I'm jumping from university to university, giving seminars online, talking about the academic roots of Islamophobia. All that was required was to actually link with these people, communicate with them on a physical level, on a human level, and to show them that, look, we're not bad. Whatever you've been taught is wrong. Sometimes sometimes the answers are the simplest of issues. Sometimes the answers to all of these issues is right there in front of you. It is to change and nurture your akhlaq for the better. Rasulullah, how was he able to revolutionize his community? He didn't come around to the people and shove intellectual concepts down their throats. He linked with them on a human level. And they were able to change. Which brings me to the second point. The second idea towards Islamophobia and the roots of Islamophobia is the attitude or their understanding of the attitude of Islam. When you look at the Quran, their idea or their claim is that the Quran itself otherizes people. The Quran, the message of the Quran is that Islam is the truth. All the other religions are not considered to be true. Islam supersedes all the other ideologies and philosophies and religions. Allah categorizes people in the Holy Quran. There are the believers, there are the munafiqeen, and then there are the disbelievers. Allah categorizes those who are Ahlul Jannah and those who are Ahlul Nar. So Allah is the one who categorizes people. He creates or He engages in this process of othering the believers and then the disbelievers. Because the Muslims see that the Quran is the truth, they are not open to dialogue. This is a fabrication that is presented, that the Muslims are not open in engaging in any dialogue, engaging in any discussion. In fact, they shut doors towards all discussions. Well, that's not the reality. When you look at the history of Islam, you look at the history of the Imams, they were always open in engaging in dialogue. Because Muslims see that Islam is the truth, they consider it to be the only truth. Whereas secular society tells you and shows you that there can be multiple truths. Whatever you believe to be the truth is your truth. And what I consider myself, or what I consider true for myself, is my truth. So there are multiple realities, there are multiple truths, and not necessarily one truth that the Quran proposes. Well, that applies to everyone else. Everyone who has their own truth, for example, believes that their truth is better than all the other truths that exist. You could identify yourself as a dolphin. No one has the right to object. But you believe that your identification is better and greater than everyone else's. Islam, for Christianity, those who ascribe to Christianity believe their religion is true. Judaism likewise. Atheists believe their values are truer and greater than all the other values that exist in the world. So why is it that Muslims and Islam are isolated and there is oppression that is directed towards them? Just as how you have the epistemical right to hold an opinion, we also have the epistemical right to hold an opinion and to live by it as well. Islam does engage in the concept of otherization, but not in a bad way, in a good way. In the way that when we see that there are people who are non-Muslims, Islam never advocates the idea that you should treat them differently. Never turn to them unjustly. Never show bad akhlaq to them. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala, in his wasiyah to his Shia, he says, وَعَلَيْكُمْ بِمُجَامِلَةِ أَهْلِ الْبَاطِلِ. When it comes to your interactions with those who are on the wrong path, he says, engage in good actions, beautify your actions for them. Not just once or twice, make it your character. Identify yourself that whenever you commit an act, it is the beautifications, it is the best of your deeds. He says, تَحَمَّلُوا الظَّيْمَ مِنْهُمْ. It says when it comes to their oppression that is directed towards you, have patience, have sabr. Handle what they throw towards you. That's the guidance that the Imam alayhi salam is saying. The philosophy that the Imam is presenting here is remarkable. The ayah of the Holy Quran, when it looks at human nature, human nature is that when someone is good towards us, we show good towards them. هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا Ihsan. For good, there is good. But that's not the philosophy that's being presented here. The philosophy that's being presented here is وَيَدْرَؤُونَ بِالْحَسَنِ السَّيِّئَةِ. Do good to repel evil. In the face of evil, there should be good. And good will have the ability to extinguish evil. When someone is violent, or not violent, if someone is rude, if someone is abusive, if someone is insulting towards you, and you respond in kindness, there is a change that occurs within their heart. You will not see it directly, immediately, but later on in their day, they will realize that I was rude and I was bad, but it was responded with good. Why was it responded with good? That change has an effect on them. Slowly, you've now created a root in their heart. You've planted a seed which they will then develop if they wish to develop, if they have the intention to develop, as to why you were good to them. When they then later find out that it is because of your principles, as a Muslim, naturally there is a tendency and an attraction that is felt towards the religion of Islam. For every good, for every evil, there should be good. Only the hardest of hearts will abuse goodness with evil. And those are very, very rare to come across. Naturally, human beings, they respond with good. They respond positively when good is done towards them. When you look at Malik al-Ashtar, the famous story of Malik al-Ashtar, he's walking down the streets of Kufa. They say there was a man standing by the side of the street with one of his friends. He was eating dates. He takes the pit of the date and he throws it towards Malik. It hits Malik right on the face. Malik al-Ashtar carries on walking. The guy is laughing his head off as to how he hit Malik on the face. He doesn't know who Malik al-Ashtar is. When Malik al-Ashtar walks away, his friend, he looks towards his friend is shocked, godsmacked. He says, what's wrong with you? He says, do you know who that person was? He says, no, I don't. He says, that was Malik al-Ashtar, the second hand of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, the commander of the general, or the general of the army of the Imam alayhi salam. When the man knew who he threw the date pit towards, he runs after him. He couldn't find him, so he goes towards Masjid al-Kufa. When he enters Masjid al-Kufa, he sees Malik al-Ashtar praying. So he waits until he finishes his prayers. He turns to him, he says, forgive me for my actions. Malik al-Ashtar simply replies, he says, I prayed my turaq as-salah that Allah forgives you for what you've did, or for what you've done. For evil there is goodness. It changes the hearts of the people. It's not something that should be belittled. This is from the second perspective. The third perspective, the idea that has been fabricated is that Islam is an oppressive religion. And this is a built-up from what we discussed last night. Why is Islam an oppressive religion? Well, because it has all of these conditions, it has all of these stipulations and restrictions. You as a human being, you're free, especially in your private affairs, in the privacy of your own home, you are free to do whatever you want, as long as you do not harm someone else. But when Islam places all of these restrictions on you, it suppresses you. You're forced to do something that you do not want to do. That's a manifestation of oppression. You're being harmed. Therefore, Islam is an oppressive religion. We need to liberate Muslims from Islam. Our response to this? Preserve your Muslim identity. More so now than ever before. Preserve your Shi'i identity. It is gold that has been given to us that we need to cherish. By leaving and abandoning Islam, the values of the Quran and the Ahlul-bayt, if you were to adopt any value that is presented to you, it's like having dust instead of gold. Preserve your identity. You know, within the UK, after 7/7, certain changes were made. Political changes were made. There were certain policies that were enacted very, very quickly, which were interpreted. Looking back, they were interpreted as Islamophobic, according to many, many researchers. One of these policies was the search and stop. If you looked like a Muslim, a person with a beard, Pakistani, Indian origin, the police had every right to stop you and to search you on the spot. If you refused, then you were suspicious. That was one. There was a second known as the prevent policy. The prevent policies were enacted in school. So now you had, over the past couple of years, you had researchers within universities like Saeed Shah, for example, in the University of Leicester, University of Warwick have done some research on this issue as well. They say that the prevent strategy were enacted in school. If a child in primary school or secondary school exhibited or said anything that seemed to be a manifestation of radicalization or extremism, the teacher had the responsibility to report him or her to the principal. The principal would then take it towards the authorities. Anything that represented extremism or radicalization, the teachers would report them. So what happened was dozens upon dozens upon dozens of cases where children were being reported. I'll give you one example that took place in 2017. December 2017, a child went to school. The teacher told the child, go home, as part of your homework, creative writing, describe the house that you live in. So the child went home, did his homework, came back the next day, gave it in. The teacher read what the child wrote and then reported the child. The father narrates, according to some of the news sources, the Telegraph, Guardian, Daily Mail, and so on and so forth, the police came to the house. The police interrogated the father. The police isolated the child from the parents for a while until the issue was cleared. What happened? What was the issue? The child wrote in his homework that I live in a terrorist home. I live in a terrorist house. The child was 10 years old. It turns out, according to the sources, that the father could not even speak English. This is important. Why? Because these are first-generation migrants. So English is not their first language. The child wrote, I live in a terrorist house. So they interviewed the child. Oh, what do you mean by a terrorist house? What's your parents teaching you? What's your father teaching you? It turned out that the child was meant to write, I live in a terrorist house. Now, of course, if you're familiar with the houses in the UK, you have a semi-detached, you have a detached, and you have a terraced house. So the child was supposed to say, I live in a terraced house. Instead, he wrote, I live in a terrorist house. The teacher, you see, this is something that we laugh about because he's 10 years old. We know that English is not his first language. We laugh it off. But the teacher reported that child to the police. The process itself has an impact on the child and on the family. It could traumatize the child. That's the issue here. It traumatizes the child. Now, living and growing up in secular society, when we see such levels of oppression, such levels of victimization, such levels of alienation, I'm left with a choice. I can compromise on my Islamic identity and values to blend in and integrate within society. Researchers in Warwick University, they discovered something very interesting. They did a lengthy research looking at students in the madrasa. You know, the madrasa within our madhab, within the Khoja Shia Ithnashari madhab, is what we see, you know, a Saturday school, Sunday school. But when you look at the Sunnis, the madrasa is very much established. 3-4 days throughout the week and so on and so forth. So it's a very much integral part of their weekly lives. So they did a research. They interviewed the students in the madrasa. They realized that the students in the madrasa have multiple personalities. When they go to mosque and madrasa, they behave in one way. They go to school and they engage in secular society, they behave in a different way. The human being is not programmed to have multiple personalities. It has an impact on you on a psychological level. It's an image that you're now preserving, and it's an act, and there is only so much you can act for, how long you can act for. Sooner or later, you will have to compromise on certain values. Either it's this value or it's that value. Majority of the times, it is Islamic values that are compromised and are sacrificed. That, when you realize that when over a period of 10, 15, 20 years, Muslims now no longer see Islam as a valuable teaching, as a concept that they should live their lives by, but Islam is reduced to a culture. Just as how Christians have reduced Christianity to a culture. The churches are empty, they're up for sale. And it's usually the Muslims who are buying it and converting it into churches. But that's the trend that is now quite vigilant and visible at this state in time. When you look at Karbala, the primary message of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, his entire movement was preserve the message of Islam. Whatever it takes. Do not compromise. Preserve it. With his case, he gave his life preserving it. The akhlaq that he demonstrates with his companions. On the 10th of Muharram, there was a Christian alongside him. The father, the husband, the wife, and the mother of the husband. 3 individuals that were Christians. In a short span of time that they engaged with the Imam, they were so overwhelmed by the akhlaq of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, they converted, and the husband also gave his life for the religion of Islam. Preserving and aiding and assisting Abi Abdullah. That's a remarkable change in a very short frame of time. On the 10th of Muharram, he seeks permission from his mother. They go towards the battle, or he goes towards the battlefield. When he goes towards the battlefield, he fights. His mother tells him, go and give your life. You will see the benefits of this in the hereafter when Rasulullah intercedes for you. He goes and he fights, he kills a handful, then he comes back to his mother. He says, oh my mother, are you pleased with me? His mother says, I will never be pleased with you until you give your life. He bids farewell to his mother, he bids farewell to his wife, he comes back, he returns to the battlefield, they kill him, they sever his arm and his leg, then in the end, they sever his head and they throw it back to his mother. There was another family, again, husband, wife, and the mother of the husband, by the name of Abdullah ibn Umair, newlywed. His wife refuses, you cannot go and fight and give your life. His mother was telling her son, go and give your life. Don't listen to your wife, go and give your life, sacrifice for Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. They say on the 10th of Muharram, he goes and he fights. When he fights, he is struck. Before he is struck, he sees his wife one final time. And his wife is pleading, she's begging, do not go and fight. I cannot bear to lose you. We have an entire life to spend together. These individuals, they did not have the obligation to defend Islam. They could have left and continued their lives. But then all of a sudden she changes her mind, she comes back and she says, go and give your life. So he turns to his wife, Abdullah ibn Umair. He says, why have you changed your mind? She replies, she says, my heart is broken. When I look at Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, I heard him say, Hal min nasirin yansurna. Is there anyone out there who is willing to help and aid me? She says, when I heard Abi Abdullah say this, my heart broke. Go and give your life. He enters the battlefield. He's struck. As he is on the verge of dying, the wife comes out. She sits alongside him. She comforts him. Then he dies in her arms. Shimr ibn Dhil Joshan sees her. Shimr then turns to Rustum. He says, Rustum, go. They say that Rustum, he took a tent pole. He came behind her. She did not know, and he struck her on her head. A blow so severe that she died on the spot alongside her husband, the first female martyr of Karbala. Then you had companions like Muslim ibn Awsaja. You had companions like Burayr. They gave their lives valiantly, with bravery, with confidence. Muslim is in his final moments. Who approaches Muslim? Habib ibn Madahir. Habib ibn Madahir, he sits alongside his brother Muslim. They were both partners. One would be in charge of the left wing, one would be in charge with the right wing. They fought together. He approaches his brother Muslim, he sits alongside him. He says, Ya Muslim, Bakhen, Bakhen. Congratulations, now enter the kingdom of heaven. He says, Ya Muslim, my heart is broken seeing you in this state. Ya Muslim, if I had known that I would outlive you, I would have asked you, Ya Muslim, what's your wasiyah? I would have made sure to execute your wasiyah. Muslim, in his final moments, he stretches his arm, he points towards Abi Abdullah. He says, Ya Habibi, Ya Habib, my wasiyah to you, look at that man, defend him, give your life for him. They say, Habib, after Muslim passes, he prepares for battle. He was one of the senior companions, the eldest of the companions from Kufa, a nobleman from Kufa. He enters the battlefield and he calls out to his enemies. He says, if you do not know who I am, let me tell you who I am. I am Habib, the son of the great Madahir. I have mounted for war in the midst of fire. Although your numbers are great and your armaments are superior, we have loyalty and we are steadfast. He engages in battle, he kills a handful until one man comes towards him. They say one man approaches him and stabs him with a spear. Another man approaches him and strikes him on the head. A blow so severe, Habib falls from his horse. When Habib collapses on the sons of Karbala, he's old, so it takes him a while to get up on his feet. As he slowly stands, they say another man came towards him and struck Habib. When he struck Habib, he executed Habib. What happened afterwards, it's a tragedy in itself. These two individuals that helped one another bring down Habib, they began arguing with one another. They began fighting with one another. One would say to the other, I am the one who killed Habib, therefore I deserve the rewards from Ibn Ziyad. The second would reply, I am the one who aided you, so I deserve the rewards from Ibn Ziyad. Until they compromised. One of them then hanged the head of Habib on his horse. He then flaunted the head of Habib amongst the army. He then called out to them that I am the one responsible for killing Habib ibn Madahir. When Abu Abdullah sees their behavior, he turns to Allah. He says, Allah, Allah, inna Allahi ahtasib nafsi wa humatu as-sahabi. He says, Ya Allah, I turn to you and I seek hope from you that you will seek revenge for me and my companions. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Matam al-Hussein.